Japanese intelligence officers in 1942 had a problem. They were intercepting American radio communications across the Pacific, thousands of messages every day. But there was something wrong. Some of these transmissions made absolutely no sense. The words weren't English. They weren't any language Japanese codebreakers recognized. And no matter how hard they tried, they couldn't crack it. What they didn't know was that they were listening to a weapon that would help win the war. And that weapon was a language that had never been written down. Imagine you're a Japanese signals intelligence officer stationed somewhere in the Pacific in 1943. Your job is to intercept and decode American military communications. You're good at your job. You've been trained in cryptography. You speak English fluently. You've cracked American codes before. This is what you do. But lately, you've been picking up these radio transmissions that don't make any sense. They're not encrypted in the normal way. They're not using code books. The Americans are just talking. But the language is completely foreign. It's got sounds you've never heard before. Grammar that doesn't follow any pattern you recognize. Words that seem to have no connection to English or any other language you know. You bring it to your superiors. They assign more people to work on it. Linguists, code breakers, the best minds in Japanese intelligence. Months go by. You've collected hundreds of hours of these transmissions. You've analyzed them every way you know how, and you've made exactly zero progress. You can't decode a single word. What you don't know is that you're listening to Navajo, a Native American language spoken by maybe 50,000 people, almost all of them in the American Southwest. A language so complex that linguists consider it one of the hardest languages on earth to learn. A language that had no written form and no dictionary that outsiders could access. A language that the Japanese had no way of understanding because they'd never encountered it before. And the Americans were using Navajo speakers as human encryption machines. They called them code talkers, and they were about to become one of the most effective intelligence assets of the entire Pacific War. Hash the problem America had. Let's back up to 1942. The Americans had a serious communications problem in the Pacific. Radio was essential for coordinating operations. You needed it for everything: calling in artillery, requesting air support, reporting enemy positions, coordinating attacks. Without radio, modern warfare doesn't work. But radio has a fatal flaw: anyone can listen. The Japanese were intercepting American communications constantly, and they were good at breaking codes, really good. The Americans would develop a new code, start using it, and within weeks or sometimes days the Japanese would crack it. Then they'd know everything: troop movements, attack plans, supply routes, everything. This was getting Americans killed. There are documented cases where Japanese forces knew about American operations before they happened because they'd broken the codes. They'd set up ambushes. They'd reinforce positions that were about to be attacked. They'd evacuate areas that were about to be bombed. The Americans needed a solution desperately. Traditional encryption methods weren't working. Code books could be captured. Encryption machines took too long in the heat of battle. By the time you encrypted a message, sent it, and the other side decrypted it, the tactical situation might have completely changed. What the military needed was a way to communicate that was fast, accurate, and completely unbreakable by the Japanese. Some genius suggested using Native American languages. The idea wasn't completely new. The Army had tried something similar in World War I with Choctaw speakers. It had worked pretty well. The Germans never figured it out, but that program had been small and informal. What the Marines wanted for World War II was bigger, more organized, more systematic. They needed a language that was complex enough that outsiders couldn't learn it easily. That had no written form the Japanese could study. That was spoken by enough people that they could recruit a decent number of speakers. And ideally, a language that had no connection to any Asian languages, so Japanese linguists would have no frame of reference. Navajo checked every box. It's insanely complex. It has tones that change meaning. It has sounds that don't exist in English or Japanese. The grammar is completely different from Indo-European languages, and most importantly, there were no published dictionaries or grammars that the Japanese could get their hands on. The only way to learn Navajo was from Navajo speakers, and all of them were in America. The first code talkers. In 1942, the Marine Corps recruited 29 Navajo men for a pilot program. These guys were young, mostly in their late teens or early 20s. Many of them had grown up on the Navajo reservation in Arizona and New Mexico. Some had been to boarding schools where they'd been punished for speaking Navajo and forced to speak English. Now the military wanted them specifically because they spoke Navajo. The irony wasn't lost on them. The American government had spent decades trying to erase native languages. Boarding schools had literally beaten native kids for speaking their own languages. Now suddenly the Marines wanted them because of that same language. But these guys were patriots. They wanted to serve. They wanted to prove themselves. So they signed up. The first group went through basic training like any other Marine. Then they got sent to Camp Elliott near San Diego for special training. Their job was to develop a code based on Navajo that could be used for military communications. This was harder than it sounds. Navajo didn't have words for military equipment. No word for tank. No word for fighter plane. No word for amphibious assault. So they made them up. They created a whole military vocabulary in Navajo. A tank became a che-da-gahi, which means tortoise in Navajo. A bomber became a jaysho, which means buzzard. A battleship became a lotso, which means whale. They took Navajo words for things that existed in nature and applied them to military equipment. It was creative and it made sense to Navajo speakers, but it would be completely opaque to anyone else. They also created a phonetic alphabet. Military communication requires spelling out words sometimes. But you can't just spell in Navajo because the Japanese might recognize English letters. So they assigned Navajo words to each letter. A was walachi, which means ant. B was shush, which means bear. C was mosi, which means cat. If you needed to spell out a word, you'd use these Navajo terms and the person on the other end would write down the first letter of each English translation. It sounds complicated, and it was. But Navajo speakers could learn it quickly because it was based on their own language. And outsiders, they had no chance. Even if a Japanese linguist somehow learned Navajo, which would take years, they still wouldn't know this specific military code that had just been invented. Guadalcanal, the first test. The Code Talkers saw their first combat on Guadalcanal in August 1942. This was one of the first major American offensives in the Pacific. The fighting was brutal. The Japanese were determined to hold the island. The Marines were fighting in jungle conditions with limited supplies and constant enemy attacks. Communication was chaos. The Japanese were intercepting everything. They were jamming radio frequencies. They were sending false messages to create confusion. Standard codes were taking too long to encode and decode. Officers were getting frustrated because by the time a message got through, the situation on the ground had changed. Then the code talkers started working, and everything changed. They could transmit and receive messages in seconds. No encoding, no decoding, no code books. Just one Navajo speaker talking to another Navajo speaker. The Japanese could intercept all they wanted. It didn't matter. They couldn't understand a word. There's this story from Guadalcanal that really shows how effective they were. An American position was getting hit by Japanese artillery. They needed counter-battery fire from American artillery, and they needed it fast. A code talker got on the radio and transmitted the coordinates and fire mission in Navajo. Total transmission time, about 20 seconds. The message was received, understood, and the artillery started firing within minutes. The same message using standard encryption would have taken at least 30 minutes to encode, transmit, and decode. In combat, that's the difference between life and death. The code talkers were so fast that officers started requesting them specifically. They wanted code talkers attached to their units because it gave them a huge tactical advantage. And the Japanese had no idea what was happening. They were intercepting these transmissions. They knew they were important because they'd hear them right before American artillery would start up or airstrikes would come in. But they couldn't understand the language. They couldn't break the code because there was no code to break. It was just a language they'd never encountered. The Japanese tried to figure it out. Japanese intelligence went into overdrive trying to crack this thing. They recorded transmissions. They brought in linguists. They analyzed the sounds and tried to match them to known languages. Nothing worked. Some thought it might be a Native American language, but which one? There were hundreds. And even if they figured out it was Navajo, how would they learn it? There were no Japanese linguists who spoke Navajo. There probably weren't any non-Navajo people anywhere who spoke it fluently. They tried frequency analysis. In normal codes, certain letters or words appear more often than others. You can use statistics to break codes this way, but Navajo didn't follow the same patterns as English. The language structure was completely different. Frequency analysis was useless. They tried capturing equipment, hopping to find code books or encryption keys, but there were no code books. The code was in the heads of the code talkers. You can't capture that. You can't steal that. The only way to break it would be to capture a code talker and force him to talk. But the code talkers were Marines. They were trained to resist interrogation, and they knew how valuable they were. The chances of getting useful information from a captured code talker were basically zero. There are Japanese intelligence reports from 1943 and 1944 that talk about this mysterious code. They call it Unbreakable. They say their best code breakers have made no progress. They're clearly frustrated. One report says something like, the Americans have developed a communication system that appears to be based on an unknown native dialect. All attempts at decryption have failed. What really drove the Japanese crazy was that they could tell the code talkers were transmitting important tactical information in real time, but they were completely helpless to stop it or understand it. They knew American artillery coordinates were being called in. They knew attack plans were being communicated. They just couldn't intercept the information in any useful way. The code expands. After Guadalcanal proved the concept worked, the Marine Corps went all in on the Code Talker program. They recruited more Navajo men, hundreds of them eventually. They expanded the code, added more military terms, created more specialized vocabulary for different types of operations. By 1944, there were code talkers in almost every major Marine operation in the Pacific. Tarawa, Saipan, Peleliu, Iwo Jima, Okinawa, they were everywhere, and they were essential. Commanders who had code talkers in their units consistently reported that they provided faster, more secure communications than any other method available. The code itself evolved. They added terms for new equipment as it was developed. They created code words for specific operations. They developed shortcuts and abbreviations that made communication even faster. And they did all of this while maintaining perfect security. Not a single code talker ever compromised the code. Not one. The training got more sophisticated too. New recruits would go through basic Marine training, then code talker school. They'd memorize the entire code, all the military vocabulary, the phonetic alphabet, common phrases. They'd practice transmitting and receiving until they could do it perfectly under pressure. Because in combat, there's no time for mistakes. And here's something important. The code talkers weren't just radio operators. They were Marines first. They went through the same training as everyone else. They fought in the same battles. Many of them saw heavy combat. Some were wounded. Some were killed. They weren't sitting safely in the rear. They were right there on the front lines, transmitting messages while bullets were flying and shells were exploding around them. Iwo Jima, the peak. If you want to see the code talkers at their most effective, look at Iwo Jima. This was February 1945, one of the bloodiest battles in Marine Corps history. The Japanese had turned the entire island into a fortress. The Marines were taking horrific casualties. Communication was absolutely critical because the fighting was so intense and so close quarters that friendly fire was a constant danger. There were 6 code talkers in the initial landing force on Iwo Jima. They worked around the clock. In the first 48 hours of the battle, these 6 men transmitted over 800 messages. Every single one was received and understood perfectly. 0 errors. And the Japanese couldn't understand any of them. Think about what that means. 800 messages in 2 days, coordinates for artillery, airstrike requests, situation reports, casualty reports, supply requests, all transmitted in Navajo, all received instantly with no need for decryption. This level of communication speed and security gave the Marines a huge advantage in coordinating their operations. The Japanese on Iwo Jima were still trying to intercept and decode American communications. They had people listening to the radio frequencies constantly, but the Navajo transmissions might as well have been gibberish. They were picking up these messages, recording them, and they were completely useless. Meanwhile, the Marines were using that intelligence to coordinate attacks, call in support, and systematically destroy Japanese positions. One Marine officer on Iwo Jima said the code talkers were worth their weight in gold. He said having instant, secure communications meant he could coordinate with other units and with support elements without worrying about the Japanese knowing his plans. He said it probably saved hundreds of lives because they could call in artillery and air support accurately and quickly without the Japanese being able to predict or interfere with it. There's a specific incident where code talkers coordinated a complex attack involving infantry, tanks, and artillery on a fortified Japanese position. The entire operation was planned and executed using Navajo communications. The Japanese defenders had no warning because they couldn't understand the radio traffic. The attack succeeded with relatively light casualties. That's the kind of tactical advantage the code talkers provided. The human cost. We need to talk about what it was like for the code talkers themselves. These were young men, most of them barely out of their teens, who went from Navajo reservations to some of the most brutal combat in history. They saw things no one should have to see. They lost friends. Some of them were wounded, and they carried the weight of knowing that if they were captured, they might be tortured for information about the code. There are stories of code talkers being mistaken for Japanese soldiers by other American troops because of their appearance. Some of them were nearly shot by their own side. The Marines started assigning bodyguards to protect them, partly from the enemy, but also to make sure other Americans didn't mistake them for the enemy. And they couldn't talk about what they did. The Code Talker program was classified. Even after the war ended, they were told not to discuss it. They came home as veterans, but they couldn't tell anyone about their most important contribution to the war effort. That had to be incredibly frustrating. They'd done something genuinely heroic, and they had to keep it secret. Many code talkers struggled after the war. They came back to reservations that were still dealing with poverty and discrimination. The same government that had used their language to win a war was still trying to suppress native cultures at home. Some code talkers dealt with what we now call PTSD, but had no support systems to help them. They'd seen combat, lost friends, carried enormous responsibility, and then had to deal with all of that alone because they couldn't talk about their service. The security measures. The Americans took security around the code talkers incredibly seriously. They knew that if the Japanese figured out it was Navajo, they might try to learn the language or capture speakers. So there were strict protocols. Code talkers were never supposed to be taken prisoner. Their bodyguards had orders to protect them at all costs. There are stories, probably apocryphal but maybe not, of bodyguards being told they had to kill the code talker rather than let him be captured. Whether that's true or not, it shows how valuable the program was considered. The code itself was compartmentalized. Code talkers only knew what they needed to know for their specific assignments. If one was captured, He couldn't compromise the entire program because he didn't know all the details. And the code kept evolving, so even if the Japanese had captured a code talker early in the war and somehow extracted information, that information would become less useful over time as the code changed. Documents about the program were highly classified. Very few people outside the Marine Corps even knew the code talkers existed. The Japanese certainly didn't know. They knew there was some unbreakable code, but they had no idea it was based on a Native American language or who was creating these transmissions. This security worked perfectly. The Japanese never broke the code, never even came close. There's no evidence they ever figured out it was Navajo. They went through the entire war unable to crack this one system. And that's remarkable when you consider how good Japanese intelligence was at breaking other American codes. The intelligence advantage. Let's talk about what the code talkers meant strategically. The Japanese built their Pacific strategy partly around the assumption that they could intercept and decode American communications. That had worked early in the war. It gave them real advantages. They could anticipate American moves and counter them. The code talkers took that advantage away. Suddenly, there were American communications that the Japanese couldn't read. Critical tactical information was being transmitted in real time, and they were helpless to stop it. This changed the intelligence balance significantly. American commanders could be more aggressive because they weren't worried about their communications being compromised. They could coordinate complex operations involving multiple units without fear that the Japanese would intercept the plans. They could call in support without the Japanese knowing it was coming. This made American operations more effective and more successful. The Japanese, meanwhile, were operating partially blind. They could still intercept plenty of American communications, but some of the most important messages were in Navajo. They had to assume that any operation might involve elements they couldn't see because those elements were coordinated through channels they couldn't access. This made defense harder and made them more paranoid about American capabilities. There's an interesting strategic dimension here too. The fact that the Japanese couldn't break the code made them paranoid about what else they might be missing. If the Americans had one unbreakable communication system, did they have others? How much intelligence were the Japanese failing to collect? This uncertainty had to factor into their strategic planning, and it couldn't have helped their confidence. After the war, the Code Talker program remained classified for decades after World War II ended. The Code Talkers themselves were bound by secrecy oaths. They couldn't tell their families. They couldn't tell other veterans. They went back to their lives on the reservations, and their service remained secret. The program stayed classified because the military thought they might need to use Native American code talkers again. And they did. Code talkers served in Korea and Vietnam, though not in the same numbers or with the same impact as in World War II. As long as there was a possibility of using the system, it had to remain secret. It wasn't until 1968 that the program was declassified. Finally, the code talkers could talk about what they'd done. But by then, over 20 years had passed. Some had died. Many had moved on with their lives. The recognition they deserved didn't come until much later. In 2001, the surviving code talkers were finally awarded Congressional Gold Medals. This was nearly 60 years after their service. The ceremony recognized their contribution to the war effort. Better late than never, I guess, but it's frustrating that it took so long. Today, there are memorials and museums dedicated to the code talkers. Their story is better known. Kids learn about them in school. But for decades, one of the most effective intelligence operations of World War II was almost completely unknown outside a small circle of military personnel. What made it work? So why did the Navajo Code work so well when other codes failed? Several reasons. First, it was based on a language that was genuinely difficult to learn. Navajo has verb conjugations that can create thousands of different forms from a single root. It has tones. It has sounds that don't exist in most languages. Even if a Japanese linguist had access to Navajo speakers and tried to learn it, it would take years to become fluent. And they didn't have years. Second, there was no written reference material. You couldn't buy a Navajo dictionary in Tokyo. You couldn't find Navajo grammar books. The language existed primarily as an oral tradition. To learn it, you needed to live with Navajo speakers and learn from them directly. The Japanese had no way to do that. Third, the military code built on top of Navajo added another layer of security. Even if someone learned Navajo, they still wouldn't know that turtle means tank or buzzard means bomber in the military context. You'd need to know both the language and the specific code vocabulary. Fourth, the code talkers were incredibly well-trained and disciplined. They didn't make mistakes. They didn't compromise security. They were professional about their work, which maintained the integrity of the system. And fifth, the system was fast. This is crucial. A code that's secure but slow isn't useful in combat. The Navajo Code was both secure and faster than any alternative. That combination of security and speed made it incredibly valuable tactically. The bigger picture. The Code Talker story is significant beyond just the tactical advantages they provided. It's a story about how America's diversity became a strategic advantage. The Japanese assumed they understood American culture and capabilities. They didn't account for the fact that America included people with languages and cultures completely foreign to Japanese experience. This was a blind spot. Japanese intelligence was good at breaking European-style codes. They had linguists who spoke English, French, German, but they had nothing that could help them understand Navajo. America's multicultural nature, which Japanese propaganda portrayed as a weakness, turned out to be a strength. It's also a story about irony and redemption. The same Native Americans who had been oppressed and marginalized by the American government became essential to winning the war. The same language that the government had tried to suppress became a secret weapon. There's something powerful about that, even if it doesn't excuse the historical treatment of Native Americans. And it's a story about innovation. The Code Talker program wasn't some ancient strategy. It was invented on the fly in 1942 by people who saw a problem and came up with a creative solution. It worked because people were willing to try something unconventional. The military bureaucracy could have said no, we'll stick with traditional codes, but they didn't. They took a chance on an untested idea, and it paid off enormously. The Japanese never knew. Here's the thing that's almost funny if it wasn't so frustrating for the Japanese. They spent the entire war trying to crack this code. Thousands of hours of effort. Their best codebreakers working on it. And they never figured out it was just people talking in their native language. Not encrypted. Not mechanically coded. Just Navajo speakers having conversations. After the war, when Japanese intelligence officers learned what they'd been listening to, the reaction was apparently a mix of shock and respect. They'd assumed it was some sophisticated encryption system. Finding out it was a Native American language that they'd never encountered was almost embarrassing. They'd been defeated by something they didn't know existed. There's no record of the Japanese ever getting close to breaking it. No evidence they ever identified it as Navajo. They were completely in the dark for the entire war. And that's remarkable when you consider how effective Japanese intelligence was in other areas. They broke plenty of American codes. They had successful espionage operations. But this one thing they never cracked. Japanese intelligence officers in 1942 thought they had American communications figured out. They'd broken codes before. They'd intercepted messages. They knew what to listen for. But then they started hearing these transmissions that made no sense. A language they couldn't identify, patterns they couldn't recognize, a code they couldn't break no matter how hard they tried. What they were hearing was Navajo, A language so complex and so foreign to their experience that they had no framework for understanding it. And the Americans were using Navajo speakers to transmit critical tactical information in real time with perfect security. The code talkers could coordinate attacks, call in artillery, report positions, and do it all faster than any encryption system, while remaining completely secure from Japanese interception. The Japanese spent the entire war trying to crack this code. They failed completely. They never broke it, never even figured out what language it was. Meanwhile, the code talkers helped win battles from Guadalcanal to Okinawa. They transmitted thousands of messages. 0 were ever decoded by the enemy. 0 errors in transmission. It was possibly the only code in modern warfare that was never broken. And it wasn't even really a code. It was just people talking, speaking the language they'd grown up with, the language the American government had once tried to erase. That language became one of the most effective weapons in the Pacific War. The Japanese couldn't believe what they were hearing, and they never figured it out. Hit subscribe for more World War II stories that never made the history books.